Rebecca West, Things Worth Fighting For. Introduction to Black Lamb and Grey Falcon by Rebecca West, 2007. More than a decade ago, at the height of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s that succeeded the disintegration or fall or destruction of Yugoslavia, and so much then hung upon which of the preceding terms one chose to employ for that bloody catastrophe, I returned from a voyage to Macedonia to attend a meeting for Yugoslav Democrats at the Cooper Union in New York City. Here I was, under the roof where Abraham Lincoln himself had spoken of union and of the consequences of disunion, and I remember the shiver with which I stood on the same podium to give my own little speech. At a bookstall, I picked up a copy of Ivo Andrić's classic, The Bridge on the Drina, and a few other texts I had read or desired to reread, and then hesitated over the book that you now hold in your hands. I know, in other words, what you may be thinking. More than 1,100 pages of densely wrought text concerning what Neville Chamberlain once called, in the same context but another reference, a faraway country of which we know nothing. Not just far away in point of distance either, but remote in point of time and period. A country that no longer exists. An Atlantis of the mind. On page 773 of the edition I picked up, West resignedly and pessimistically alludes to this book which hardly anyone will read by reason of its length. The action of buying it seemed almost antiquarian, like laying out money for the purchase of a large anachronistic device. Nevertheless, having learned from other readings to respect the mind of Rebecca West, I decided on the outlay and have been regarding it as a great bargain ever since. Imagine that you have, in fact, purchased at least 4 fine books for the price of one. The first and most ostensible of these volumes is one of the great travel narratives of our time, which seeks to net and analyze one of the most gorgeous and various of ancient and modern societies. The second volume gives an account of the mentality and philosophy of a superbly intelligent woman whose feminism was above all concerned with the respect for and the preservation of true masculinity. The third volume transports any thoughtful or historically minded reader into the vertiginous period between the 2 world wars, a time when those with intellectual fortitude could face the fact that the next war would be even more terrible than the last, and who did not flinch from that knowledge. The fourth volume is a meditation on the never-ending strife between the secular and the numinous, the faithful and the skeptical, the sacred and the profane. The woman who brought off this signal polymathic achievement, based on 3 separate but interwoven visits to the Balkans, and published just as the Second World War was disclosing itself as a conflict of ultimate horror, was born Cicely Fairfield in 1892. She demonstrated early brilliance as a reviewer and journalist, soon adopting the name Rebecca West, the heroine of Henrik Ibsen's play Rosmersholm. Her first published book, A Study of Henry James, was issued in 1916, and her first novel, The Return of the Soldier, in 1918. She was thus ideally positioned in point of age and precocity to take a hand in the journalistic and critical ferment that followed the Great War. Although inclined to experiment and to the eclectic, she published articles in Wyndham Lewis's Vorticist magazine Blast, in addition to Ford Mannix Ford's English Review. She was no intellectual butterfly, and after a brief flirtation with Garsington and Bloomsbury and the world of Virginia Woolf and Ottiline Morell, found her natural intellectual home on the free-thinking liberal left. She was on terms with George Bernard Shaw and Bertrand Russell while barely out of her teens, and continued this pattern by conducting a long older man affair with H.G. Wells, by whom she soon had a son, Anthony. Her relationships with men were always to be passionate and distraught and full of misery and infidelity, and they included a fling with Lord Beaverbrook, the power-crazy newspaper tycoon who is the original of Lord Copper in Evelyn Waugh's Scoop. She managed a long marriage to an English banker, my husband, otherwise never named, in Black Lamb and Grey Falcon. But even while in Yugoslavia with him, as her letters and diaries reveal, she was racked with anxiety about another lover. One has, from most accounts of her very long and tempestuous life, the sense of a brilliant and ambitious but unhappy woman, deeply intellectual and much preoccupied with public affairs, who had to strive extremely hard in a man's world and who found men both essential and impossible. There is an evocative description of her by Virginia Woolf, who wrote that she has great vitality, is a broad-browed, very vigorous, distinguished woman, but a buffeter and a battler, has taken the waves, I suppose, and can talk in any language. Why then this sense of her being a lit-up modern block, floodlit by electricity? Block there may be somewhat unflattering, though for Mrs. Woolf to instance the waves is obviously a mark of respect. But lit up, though West may have seemed, she was also frequently plunged in darkness. Indeed, nothing better conveys her sense of mingled urgency, responsibility and pessimism than the way in which she describes the onset of her profound engagement with Yugoslavia. Recovering from surgery in a hospital ward in England in October 1934, she hears a radio announcement of the assassination of King Alexander and appreciates at once that a grand crisis is in the making. Like any intelligent European of that date, she experiences a natural frisson at the murder of a crowned head of the Balkans, but she's also aware that the political class in her country is not much less myopic than it was at the time of Sarajevo, only 20 years earlier. She feels at once helpless and ignorant and culpable in both these aspects. To know nothing about the Balkans is, she reflects, to know nothing about my own destiny. At this time, Naomi Mitchison is writing about the bloody events in Vienna that will lead to the Anschluss, and others are experiencing the premonition of impending confrontation in Spain. But for West, it is Yugoslavia that is the potentially seismic country. In considering her book, then, we must try to envisage that now obliterated nation as she did. This is to say, we must begin by looking at it through the reverse end of the telescope. The murder of King Alexander puts her in mind, successively but not in order, of the assassination of Empress Elizabeth of Austria in 1898, which had much discomposed her own mother, of the fervour of the schismatic Donatists of the 4th century, of the cruel butchery of King Alexander Obrenović of Serbia, together with his wife Queen Draga in the royal palace in Belgrade in 1903, and finally of the cataclysmic shooting of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his consort in the capital of Bosnia in June 1914. Of this event, West notes ruefully that at the time she was too much absorbed in her own private concerns to pay the necessary attention. We know that West was a strong admirer of Marcel Proust and believed him to be one of the originators of modernism. And Janet Montefiore, one of the most deft and penetrating students of her work, is surely right in describing this bedridden moment of connected recollection as a Proustian layering. Indeed, and without getting too much ahead of our story, the Madeleine of the 28th of June 1914 in particular prompts memories in many more minds than that of Rebecca West. It was on that same day, in 1389, St. Vitus's Day, that the Serbian armies of Prince Lazar had known the bitterness of utter vanquishment at the hands of the Turks on the field of Kosovo. A permanent wound in the national heart that was to be cynically reopened by an anniversary speech given by Slobodan Milosevic on the very same date in 1989. For West, in 1934, it seemed more simply that, when I came to look back upon it, my life had been punctuated by the slaughter of royalties, by the shouting of newsboys who have run down the streets to tell me that someone has used a lethal weapon to turn over a new leaf in the book of history. I shall have to do some interleaving and layering myself in distinguishing and also separating these 4 books. Unschooled as she was, Rebecca West decided at once that the slaying of King Alexander was the work, at least by proxy, of the thuggish and covetous regime of Benito Mussolini. In the first few pages of the book, she offers an angry but mordant psychological profile of the mentality of Italian fascism and of its Croatian and Macedonian clients. This cancellation of process in government leaves it an empty violence that must perpetually and at any cost outdo itself, for it has no alternative idea and hence no alternative activity. The long servitude in the slums has left this kind of barbarian without any knowledge of what man does when he ceases to be violent, except for a few uncomprehending glimpses of material prosperity. This aggressiveness leads obviously to the establishment of immense armed forces, and furtively to incessant experimentation with methods of injuring the outer world other than the traditional procedure of warfare. The above passage can be taken as representative of many others in which West combines a near patrician contempt for the baseness of fascism with her own political radicalism and her keen insight into motive. That this latter insight is essentially feminist is proved repeatedly by her choice of words and examples. Of the martyred Empress Elizabeth, for example, she writes that she could not reconcile herself to a certain paradox which often appears in the lives of very feminine women. She knew that certain virtues are understood to be desirable in women: beauty, tenderness, grace, house pride, the power to bear and rear children. She believed that she possessed some of these virtues, and that her husband loved her for it. Indeed, he seemed to have given definite proof that he loved her by marrying her against the will of his mother, the Archduchess Sophie. Against this latter woman, West deploys a rhetorical skill that is perhaps too little associated with feminism: the ability to detect a pure bitch at 20 paces. The Archduchess Sophie is a figure of universal significance. She was the kind of woman whom men respect for no other reason than that she is lethal, whom a male committee will appoint to the post of hospital matron. She had none of the womanly virtues. Especially did she lack tenderness. She was also a great slut. Incautious would be the man, but still more the woman, who incurred the fine wrath of Rebecca West. Her ability to appraise historical and global figures as if she had recently been personally oppressed or insulted by them was a great assistance in driving her narrative forward. Speaking of narrative, she tells us very early on that her preferred analogy, her chosen means of connecting the past to the present, is that of the sexual affairs of individuals. As we grow older and see the ends of stories as well as their beginnings, we realize that to the people who take part in them, it is almost of greater significance that they should be stories, that they should form a recognizable pattern, than that they should be happy or tragic. The men and women who are withered by their fates, who go down to death reluctantly but without noticeable regrets for life, are not those who have lost their mates prematurely or by perfidy, or who have lost battles or fallen from early promise in circumstances of public shame, but those who have been jilted or were victims of impotent lovers, who have never been summoned to command or been given any opportunity for success or failure. She speculates that this is possibly true not only of individuals, but of nations, and this hypothesis becomes in fact the organizing principle of the book. Two other recurring notes are likewise introduced early on. West makes the first of innumerable cross-references to England. Throughout her travels, she compares towns, landscapes, historical events and individuals to their English counterparts, as if to provide a familiar handhold both to her readers and to herself, and asks, immediately following the passage above, what would England be like if it had not its immense Valhalla of kings and heroes? She also, in discussing Russia's influence on the region, shows a defensive but definite sympathy for the Soviet system. Having been an early critic of Bolshevism and sympathizer of its leftist and feminist victims, she appears, like many, to have postponed this reckoning until the more imperative menace of fascism had been confronted. Those who fear Bolshevist Russia because of its interventions in the affairs of other countries, she wrote, which are so insignificant that they have never been rewarded with success, forget that Tsarist Russia carried foreign intervention to a pitch that has never been equalled by any other power except the modern fascist states. In this she reflected some of the left-liberal mentality of her day, and there's no doubt that this bias inflects a good deal of her Yugoslav analysis. There is no man in the world, she wrote, not even Stalin, who would claim to be able to correct in our time the insane dispensation which pays the food producer worst of all workers. To diagnose in so few words a problem that is still with us requires skill, but to portray Joseph Stalin as a friend of the peasant would have been eyebrow-raising even in 1937. Should we allow that in that year The story of Russian communism was after all a little nearer to its inception than its end. At any rate, at the beginning of her journey, we can identify an ardent woman who manifested a nice paradoxical sympathy for the honour, bravery and pageantry of the past, and for the apparently more modern ideas of socialism and self-determination. She had stepped onto the perfect soil for one so quixotic. She never chances to employ the word, but Serbo-Croat speech has an expression that depends for its effect not on the sex lives of humans, but of animals. A vukojabina, employed to describe a remote or barren or arduous place, means literally a wolf fuck, or more exactly, the sort of place where wolves retire to copulate. This combination of a noble and fearless creature with an essential activity might well have appealed to her. The term, which could have been invented to summarize Milovan Djilas's harsh and loving portrayal of his native Montenegro, land without justice, is easily adapted to encapsulate a place that is generally, so to say, fucked up. This is the commonest impression of the Balkans now, as it was then, and West considered it her task to uncover and to praise the nobility and culture that contradicted this patronizing impression. Assisting her in this purpose, and sometimes contradicting her as well, is the near ubiquitous figure of Constantine. He's supposed to speak for all who have resisted the long rival tyrannies of Austro-Hungary and Turkey, and who are now trying to teach the discordant peoples of Yugoslavia to speak with one voice. One's attitude to the book and to West herself depends to a very great extent on one's view of Constantine. A composite based on a real person named Stanislav Vinever, he is at once a government bureaucrat and official guide, a Serb, a Jew, a nationalist, and a cosmopolitan. To add to the jumble of this picture, he's also married to Gerda, a German woman of frightful aspect and demeanour who despises almost all foreigners, most especially Jews, and who is a clear prefiguration of a full-blown Nazi. I happen to like Stanislav/Constantine. When dealing with an incensed young Bosnian who accused him of being a government stooge, he responds with some gravity by saying, "Yes, for the sake of my country, and perhaps a little for the sake of my soul, I have given up the deep peace of being in opposition." This is one of the more profoundly mature, and also among the most tragic, of the signals that West's ear was attuned to pick up. We meet Constantine early on, and we also encounter a method of Rebecca West's that has given rise to much criticism. Her non-fictional characters are conscripted, more as dramatis personae, Montefiore likens her to Thucydides, and given long speeches, even soliloquies, in which to represent sets of ideas and prejudices. This is a privilege extended not only to the people she meets. Throughout the book, both she and her husband make long and quite grammatical addresses that would be unthinkable in real life, if only because they would be interrupted if given in mixed company and walked out upon if they occurred at the domestic hearth. As a didactic tool, however, this has its uses, in that people are permitted to be advocates and are given the room to make their case. Paul Scott employs the same means in his historical fiction of the British Raj in India, often to great effect. The soliloquy is not to be despised as a means of elucidation. The first use of it occurs when West and her husband are in the Croatian capital of Zagreb, and Constantine gets into fights and arguments with some local intellectuals who do not trust or respect the new national regime with its political headquarters in the Serbian capital of Belgrade. His rather emotional attempts to make them think and feel like Slavs are recorded sympathetically by West, but this is the stage at which we can first surmise that the Serbs will turn out to be her favourites. Ambivalent as she was about Stalin, Rebecca West was acutely sensitive to the early warnings of fascism and very heartily repelled by all its manifestations. She identified it in the Yugoslav case with a general conspiracy by foreign powers to subvert and fragment the country, in which she was by no means mistaken, and she identified it in the Croatian case with the ambitions of the Vatican, in which she was not wrong either. The world now knows about the Ustashi, the cruel and chauvinistic surrogate party that established a Nazi protectorate in Croatia under military and clerical leadership during the Second World War. West saw it coming in the uninformed Catholic youth movements set up in Croatia in the 1930s, and in the persistent hostility of the Church to the Yugoslav idea in general and to the allegiance of the Serbs to Eastern Orthodoxy in particular. It deserves to be said that she tries to compensate for this partisanship by almost immediately writing a paean to Bishop Strossmayer, a Catholic Croatian eminence of the preceding century who had been genuinely humane and ecumenical. But it is also at this point that one can begin to notice her distaste for chiaroscuro. In describing Strossmayer's life and habits and character, she supplies an almost devotional portrait of a man about whom she could have known only by hearsay. Of his supposed hospitality she writes, "After supper, at which the food and drink were again delicious, there were hours of conversation, exquisite in manner, stirring in matter." This approaches the gushing. A writer who falls in love with a new and strange country will always find experience heightened in this way. The dawns are more noble, the crags loftier, the people more genuine, the food and wine more luscious. Here might be the point to try and explicate the Lamb and the Falcon of West's title. About halfway through the narrative, she is in Belgrade, and finding, as many lovers do, that her new inamorata is beginning to remind her just a little too much of her previous ones. The men in the hotel bar and the hotel itself are making Yugoslavia's capital into an emulation of some imagined bourgeois ideal, replete with modern architecture and up-to-date ideas of business-like cleverness. Soon she begins to feel the food will become indistinguishable as well. The hotel will repudiate its good fat risottos, its stews will be guiltless of the spreading red oil of paprika. I felt a sudden abatement of my infatuation for Yugoslavia. I had perhaps come a long way to see a sunset which was fading under my eyes before a night of dirty weather. Disillusionment and banality menace her on every hand, and the false jollity at the bar is mounting to a crescendo when the hotel doors swung open to admit, unhurried and at ease, a peasant holding a black lamb in his arms. He was a well-built young man with straight fair hair, high cheekbones and a look of clear sight. His suit was in the Western fashion, but he wore also a sheepskin jacket, a round black cap, and leather sandals with upturned toes, and to his ready-made shirt his mother had added some embroidery. It is as if an Englishman, raised on the romance of the Western and pining in a phony tourist saloon in Wyoming, were to see the saloon doors swing open and hear the jingle of true cowboy spurs. He stood still as a Byzantine king in fresco, while the black lamb twisted and writhed in the firm cradle of his arms, its eyes sometimes catching the light as it turned and shining like small luminous plates. So there is still hope that traditional, genuine rural society continues to pulse away under the gaudy patina of commerce and affectation. However, the next time we encounter a black lamb, we are in Macedonia, almost 400 pages further on, and this time West is not at all so sure that she likes what she sees. The Muslim peasants are converging on a large rock in an open field, and the rock is coated with coagulating blood and littered with animal body parts. I noticed that the man who'd been settling the child on the rug was now walking round the rock with a black lamb struggling in his arms. He was a young gypsy, of the kind called gunpowder gypsies because they used to collect saltpetre for the Turkish army, who are famous for their beauty, their cleanliness, their fine clothes. This young man had the features and bearing of an Indian prince, and a dark golden skin which was dull as if it had been powdered, yet exhaled a soft light. His fine linen shirt was snow white under his close-fitting jacket. His elegant breeches ended in soft leather boots, high to the knee, and he wore a round cap of fine fur. Again one notices West's keen eye for the finely featured man and for his apparel. But this time the ambient strikes her as brutish and disgusting, even alarming. Now the man who was holding the lamb took it to the edge of the rock and drew a knife across its throat. A jet of blood spurted out and fell red and shining on the browner blood that had been shed before. The gypsy had caught some on his fingers, and with this he made a circle on the child's forehead. "He is doing this," a bearded Muslim standing by explained, because his wife got this child by coming here and giving a lamb, and all children that are got from the rock must be brought back and marked with the sign of the rock. Under the opening glory of the morning, the stench from the rock mounted more strongly and became sickening. Sunset in Belgrade, sunrise in Macedonia, and suddenly the evidence of authenticity seems to contradict itself. This is a difficulty that recurs to West throughout her explorations. The Grey Falcon comes to her on another field of sacrifice, this time the plain of Kosovo, on which Prince Lazar of Serbia saw his forces divided by betrayal and slaughtered by the Turks. An antique Serbian folk song, translated on the spot by Constantine, begins the story thus. There flies a grey bird, a falcon, from Jerusalem the holy, and in his beak he bears a swallow. That is no falcon, no grey bird, but it is the Saint Elijah. This sky-born messenger brings to Prince Lazar, or Tsar Lazar as the poem has him, a choice between an earthly kingdom and a heavenly one, a choice that he decides in a way that West comes to find contemptible. Her two chosen images, therefore, are neither symmetrical nor antagonistic, but rather contain their own contradictions. It's important to know at the start what she registers throughout and at the conclusion, that feeling that some English people have always had for a patriotism other than their own. Byron in Greece had a comparable experience of simultaneous exultation and disillusionment, and even as West was making her way through the Balkans, English volunteers in Spain were uttering slogans about Madrid and Barcelona that they would have felt embarrassed to hear themselves echo for London or Manchester. Many of them were to return disappointed too. The enormous condescension of posterity was the magnificent phrase employed by E.P. Thompson to remind us that we must never belittle the past popular struggles and victories, as well as defeats, that we are inclined to take for granted. Two things are invariably present in Rebecca West's mind, and thanks to the lapse of time, not always available to our own. The first of these is the realization that an incident in Sarajevo in June 1914 had irrevocably splintered the comfortable and civilized English world of which she had a real memory. When she says the Great War, she means the war of 1914 to 1918, because though she can see a second war coming, there has as yet been no naming of the First World War. The next is her constant awareness that men decide and that women then live or die with the consequences of that decision-making. The first assault on the Yugoslav idea had been made by the hairless demagogic Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, the man who borrowed the phrase, "the year of living dangerously" from Nietzsche, though West didn't know this, and who had led the wresting of Trieste and Fiume from Yugoslav sovereignty in 1920. This piece of theatre and bombast was the precursor to Mussolini's March on Rome, and caused West to reflect. All this is embittering history for a woman to contemplate. I will believe that the battle of feminism is over, and that the female has reached a position of equality with the male, when I hear that a country has allowed itself to be turned upside down and led to the brink of war by a totally bald woman writer. Useless for a male critic to interpose that Joan of Arc apparently had a full head of hair, or that Dolores Ibarruri, La Passionaria, was even then making strong men shed hot tears for the ideals of Joseph Stalin, or that neither of these ladies was a writer or poet in the accepted sense. One simply sees what she means. And very often one has exactly no choice but to see what she means and to respect her intuitions as well as her better reasoned insights. Her intuitions and generalizations are offered in no niggardly spirit and make no attempt to disguise themselves as objective, let alone impartial. After a sweep along the Adriatic with some animadversions about the decay and enfeeblement of the Venetian Empire, she stops at the island of Rab and declares, "These people of Dalmatia gave the bread out of their mouths to save us of Western Europe from Islam, and it is ironical that so successfully did they protect us that those among us who would be broad-minded, who will in pursuit of that end stretch their minds until they fall apart in idiocy, would blithely tell us that perhaps the Dalmatians need not to have gone to that trouble, that an Islamized West could not have been worse than what we are today. The West has done much that is ill. It is vulgar and superficial and economically sadist. But it has not known that death in life which was suffered by the Christian provinces under the Ottoman Empire. An unintended element of posterity's condescension may be apparent at the close of this passage, where West writes, "Impotent and embarrassed, I stood on the high mountain and looked down on the terraced island where my saviours, small and black as ants, ran here and there attempting to repair their destiny." The difficulty in crediting any group or state with delivering Europe from the Turks or from Islam is that there are too many rival claimants for that honour and distinction. Austrians and Poles can boast of having defended the gates of Vienna, Venetians and Maltese to have hung on until the victory at Lepanto, Hungarians and Greeks to have fought to the last against Ottomanism. In Rebecca West's own lifetime, the Sublime Porte in Constantinople had staked everything on a declaration of jihad against the British Empire, and on the side of the German one in 1914, and it ended up not just losing the war, but its caliphate as well. She was always somewhat ambivalent about the British Empire, reserving the right both to admire it and to criticise it, but towards most of the other empires and nations I've just mentioned, she was generally hostile. And this was because of her feelings that they had all, at different times, betrayed the people of the Balkans, most especially the people of Serbia. It was not, after all, the arrogant Turks who had issued an ultimatum to Serbia in July 1914, though Turkey was to take the side of Austria-Hungary and Germany in the ensuing combat. Yet perhaps the most sustainedly brilliant passage in the entire book is her reconstruction of the events that led up to and away from the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. When one scans these pages, one must continually bear in mind that for her, as for most educated English people, the events of the 28th of June 1914 were the moral and emotional equivalent of the 11th of September 2001, the terrible date on which everything had suddenly changed for the worse. I cannot possibly hope to summarize the intensity and scope of her effort in this regard. In its awareness of the grand consequences of the event, it manifests an almost vibrant sense of history and drama, and its minute attention to detail. It rivals some of the more obsessive and forensic retracings of what happened in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on the 22nd of November 1963, and shares with some of those studies a subliminal but unmistakable wish that the newsreel could be run again, and one turn of the car avoided or one wretched coincidence averted, so that the fatal bullet would not meet its target after all. A little too much time and ink, perhaps, is expended in proving that the Austro-Hungarian staff must have at least covertly wished for the Archduke to have been shot. For these frigid and cynical men, a mild heir with an embarrassing wife was thereby removed, and an ideal provocation for war simultaneously furnished. It could well have been so. Certainly, the pro-war forces in Vienna seemed a little more than ready for the excuse that was offered them, and hastened to force conditions on Serbia that they knew were both unjust and unacceptable. However, as West fails to mention, the socialist faction in the outraged Serbian parliament, led by Dimitrija Tucovic, nonetheless refused to vote even for a war of self-defense. This was partly because of what they had seen of Serbian atrocities against Albanians and others in the Balkan War of 1912. These men were the equivalents of Jean Jaurès and Rosa Luxemburg in their own country. How disappointing that West's evident sympathy for Marxist internationalism should have deserted her just when it might have done her some good. There is another marvellous passage, also derived from her stay in Sarajevo, which is this time an eyewitness description, and which actually can be summarized by quotation. She chanced to be in the city on the day of a state visit from the Turkish Prime Minister, İsmet İnönü, the first such courtesy call since the conclusion of hostilities in 1918 and the proclamation by Kemal Atatürk of a secular republic in place of the caliphate. The large Muslim middle class of the city turned out in force, the bearded men donning fezes and the women wearing veils, and some hardy souls even bearing the old green flag with the crescent emblazoned upon it. Their consternation on seeing clean-shaven, high Turkish officials wearing Western suits and bowler hats was palpable. Even worse was the shock they endured on hearing the speeches of Inoni's delegation, as translated from Turkish by the Yugoslav Minister of War. The distinguished visitors from Ankara stood still, their eyes set on the nearest roof, high enough to save them the sight of this monstrous retrograde profusion of fezzes and veils, of red pates and black muzzles, while the general put back into Serbian their all-too-reasonable remarks. They had told the Muslims of Sarajevo, it seemed, that they felt the utmost enthusiasm for the Yugoslavian idea, and had pointed out that if the South Slavs did not form a unified state, the will of the great powers could sweep over the Balkan peninsula as it chose. They had said not one word of the ancient tie that linked the Bosnian Muslims to the Turks, nor had they made any reference to Islam. The crowd dispersed, West recorded, slowly and silently, as those who have been sent empty away. We had seen the end of a story that had taken 500 years to tell. We had seen the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Under our eyes, it had heeled over and fallen to the ground like a clay figure slipping off a chair. Once again, one is forced to note her innate prejudice in favour of the traditional, and somehow, therefore, the more authentic, even if this involves a preference for the fez over the standard bowler hat, and thus a slight revision of what has been said earlier about Ottoman slavery and torpor. Perhaps, as for Simone Weil, West's definition of justice was that of a refugee from the camp of victory. If the corollary of this was to hold, and the defeated were to enjoy a closer natural relationship with justice, then much of her Serb enthusiasm is, at least at that date, fairly easily explicable as well. In any event, anybody with the least sympathy for the Balkan underdogs would by then have been recruited to their side with a high degree of militancy by the extraordinary above-mentioned figure of Gerda. It is never explained how this appalling Philistine German female, a character from whom Christopher Isherwood's ghastly Berlin landlady would have been a distinct relief, can possibly have married the Jewish intellectual Constantine. Their true names were actually Stanislav and Elsa Wienerwehr, but married they are. And their grotesque partnership provides an ideal element of the farcical and the sinister, both increasing and lightening the solemn load that West and her husband must carry on their very serious trip. Gerda's presence is a torture to Constantine and a perpetual embarrassment to his English guests, but it affords some useful comic relief, as well as a Bob Fosse-like premonition of the nature of the new Germany. Informed at one point that the Wendish minority in Germany is in fact Slavic, she demands of West to be informed, if all the Wends are Slavs, why do we not send them out of Germany into the Slav countries and give the land that they are taking up to true Germans? Then the Slavs, I said, might begin to think about sending back into Germany all the German colonists that live in places like Franzstal. Why, so they might, said Gerda, looking miserable, since an obstacle had arisen in the way of her plan of making Europe clean and pure and Germanic by coercion and expulsion. She said in Serbian to her husband, "How this woman lacks tact." "I know, my dear," he answered gently, "but do not mind it. Enjoy the scenery." Gerda, then, as well as the Gelder of her husband, is a racist, both pure and simple, an ethnic cleanser, amant de la lettre, and she is one of those Teutonic types who cannot forgive, who can, in a way, not even believe the defeat and humiliation of her country in 1918. That a crew of worthless Slavs were among the apparent victors is to her an offence against nature. Think of all these people dying for a lot of Slavs, as she puts it on visiting the French war cemetery. Their local food disgusts her. When handed a dish at a picnic, her face crumpled up with a hatred too irrational to find words. Most of the people West meets and likes in Sarajevo are Jewish, and she suddenly comes to understand that is why Gerda has no time for them. Like most English liberals and radicals of that period, West was only too conscious of the injustices imposed upon Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, and at one point goes out of her way to remind us that Gerda is, of course, not characteristically German. But her husband is less tender-minded and reduces the matter to the paradoxical statement that nobody who is not like Gerda can imagine how bad Gerda is. He often supplies quite shrewd and gnomic remarks. Noticing that a shrine to the Karađorđević dynasty is strictly Serbo-Byzantine in style and, like most shrines, is built all on strictly Serb territory, he adds that this building with its enormously costly mosaics can mean nothing whatsoever to any Croatians or Dalmatians or Slovenes. Yet it is the mausoleum of their king, and superbly appropriate to him. I see that though Yugoslavia is a necessity, it is not a predestined harmony. This terse observation is worth more than many of West's own hyper-romantic excursions into the quasi-mythical history of Serbian royalty. A considerable and almost purple chapter of such romance and myth-making follows almost at once, as West visits the monastery at Verdnik, where lies the coffin of Prince Lazar, the martyr of Kosovo. There is no need to manufacture magic here, she writes, before proceeding to do just that. When this man met defeat, it was not only he whose will was frustrated. It was a whole people, a whole faith, a wide movement of the human spirit. This is told by the splendid rings on the Tsar Lazar's black and leathery hands, and the refinement of the pomp which presents him in his death. The beauty and gravity of the enfolding ritual show the worth of what was destroyed with him. I put out a finger and stroked those hard, dry hands that had been nerveless for 500 years. To admire Rebecca West is to admire the toughness of her mind and the steadiness of her gaze. It is a little dispiriting to see her committing such an evident non sequitur between the first and second of her opening sentences, and a little more than dispiriting to see her caressing a relic like any silly old woman hoping for a cure for the scrofula. She commits a more serious contradiction a little further along, this time after appearing to take at their face value the mad prophecies of a Serbian Nostradamus named Marta of Crema. In reprobating a later Serbian dynasty, the Obrenović line of Miloš and Milan, she first blames King Milan for allowing the Treaty of San Stefano in 1878, which gave almost the whole of Macedonia to Bulgaria, and then denounces the later Congress of Berlin, which undid the injustice she complains of, as called for no other reason than to frame a treaty which should deprive the democratic Slavs of their freedom and thrust them into subjection under the imperialism of Turkey and Austria-Hungary. That sequence already seems somewhat disordered, but then it's followed by this sentence. It is not to be wondered at that in 1881 Milan signed a secret convention with Austria which handed over his country to be an Austrian dependency. On the contrary, if any of West's foregoing assumptions are sound, this action seems almost incomprehensible, as does her earlier use of the term democratic. She is beginning to regard Serbia as a country that, even if unable to do anything right, can yet never be said to be in the wrong. And again we encounter her preference, at least on first meeting, for anything that is raw and elemental over anything that is tame or domesticated. Men like Mijatović, King Milan's favourite foreign minister, by the by, wanted the Serbians to lay aside this grandiose subject matter, which their destiny had given them for their genius to work upon, and instead they offered them as an alternative to be clean and briskly bureaucratic and capitalist like the West. It was as if the Mayflower and Red Indians and George Washington and the pioneer West were taken from the United States and there was nothing left but the Bronx and Park Avenue. Before long, this admiration for the atavistic has led her to describe the vile Balkan War of 1912 as a poem, and to write that there has been no fighting in our time that has had the romantic quality of that conflict. A useful corrective to this nonsense can be found in the Carnegie Endowment's contemporary report on the war, and in Leon Trotsky's first-hand reports of Serbian atrocities as printed in liberal Russian newspapers. Thus, at the almost exact midpoint of the book, West has arrived at a stage where she approves of King Alexander Karađorđević, who had hoped at the beginning of the First World War, not for a Yugoslavia, not for a union of all South Slavs, but for a greater Serbia that should add to the Kingdom of Serbia all of the Austro-Hungarian territories in which the majority of the inhabitants were Serbs, that is, Slavs who were members of the Orthodox Church. The school of thought to which he belonged